Hi, good afternoon. My name is Matt Lundgren. I'm a PhD student here at the Schar School and a fellow with the Commandant of the Marine Corps Strategist Program. This afternoon, it's my great pleasure to introduce Admiral Dennis Blair, United States Navy retired. Admiral Blair began his career in 1968 as a graduate of the United States Naval Academy, also Rhodes Scholar and White House Fellow. Throughout a distinguished 34-year career, some of the highlights were as commander of the Kitty Hawk Strike Group, as well as the commander of Pacific Command, which, as you can see, encompasses most of the region that we're talking about today. And as legend would have it, the first destroyer captain to water ski behind his ship, which is a pretty big accomplishment in and of itself. After retiring in 2002, he's held a variety of public and private positions, including the Director of National Intelligence from 2009 through 2010, and is currently the Chairman of the Board and a Senior Fellow at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. Without further ado, Admiral Blair.
Well, thanks very much, Colonel. It's good to be here. Thanks very much to the Schar School and to Ellen for inviting me. I get the impression that as I reviewed your program and saw some of your speakers, that everything has been said on this subject, but it hasn't been said by everybody. So you'll get my contribution to that. But luckily, we'll have a chance to turn it into a discussion here pretty soon. So the very title of our conference today is provocative, and Ellen asked us to consider whether we are in fact in an Asian century. The Aaron Friedberg gave you his always thought-provoking and mordant views, and you've heard these previous two panels about the overall trends in the region. You've heard about some of the security issues that I'm sure will persist into the future. North Korea, China, they will certainly be dominating the intelligence, dominating the attention of U.S. national security officials through at least 2030, the next 20 some odd years. Based on my experience in the region, there are really two opposing factors that will determine, first, whether we are in an Asian century, and second, what will be the nature of that century. And the first factor is economic development. Ellen Frost, of course, spoke with you earlier this morning. Most of the projections that I have read for Asian and world economic development show that Asian part of the world economy will continue at a rapid pace, while parts of Africa may develop more rapidly individually. They're coming from a much lower base, and for the immediate future, Asia will be a larger and larger part of the world's economic activity. So this will mean that all other countries of the world, especially the United States, the world's largest single economy, will want to do business there. And by the same token, most of the advanced, successful Asian companies will go international, whether they be Chinese, Indian, Japanese, South Asian. Now, interestingly, these same estimates project that it will be Southern Asia, or the Indo section of the Indo-Pacific region, India, Bangladesh, even potentially Pakistan, that have the greatest potential for economic growth. They also have a greater number of obstacles to it. But the sort of mainline projections show that the rate of economic growth there will be greater than it will be in China, for example, which will have the slower rate of growth of a more developed economy. And so this factor will put more emphasis in future on the Indo sub-region of the Indo-Pacific region. Now, a high level of economic development and increasing international trade, both within a region and between that region and the rest of the world, I have found are generally stabilizing factors. They tend to dampen the potential for conflict. So Asia's projected continued high level of growth, international trade growth, will mean that the governments in Asia and the rest of the world will be paying continued attention to the region, and that their policies will generally be oriented towards reducing or containing crises and preventing conflict. And so if these trends dominate, then that will, yes, make the 21st century an Asian century. But as Thucydides and others since him, like Aaron Freeberg, whom you heard this morning, have observed, there are other factors that are often more important than economic development and prosperity. And in Asia, there are two linked factors that could bring a much more tumultuous and a much more violent future. I would argue that, unfortunately, these would also make the 21st century an Asian century because the rest of the world would be sucked into confrontation and conflict there. But the first set of factors are the legacy unresolved security issues which are left over from past conflicts. And as any student of history knows, from the early 1930s through the late 1970s, Asia was just a terrible site of war after war, destruction, and country-on-country civil wars, which went on for many years. And these left a scattered legacy of unresolved conflicts. So that's the first set of factors. The second one is increasing nationalism, which is stoked, in fact, in part, sometimes, by increases in economic prosperity. Now, the hotspots in Asia are virtually all legacies of these past conflicts that ran for about 40 years. They are currently managed either by military standoffs, and the DMZ in Korea is probably the primary example, or agreements to disagree that neither side is giving up its claims in a particular conflict, but they are not going to bring military power to bear to try to solve them, at least in the near term. So if you proceed around that chart from Northeast to Southwest Asia, these major unresolved security issues include the Northern Territories, contested by Russia and Japan, the Korean Peninsula, contested by North and South Korea, with close involvement by the United States, China, and, to a lesser degree, Russia. The Senkaku, or Diaoyu Islands, contested by Japan and China, with involvement by the United States. Taiwan, contested by China and Taiwan itself, heavy involvement by the United States. The South China Sea, contested by China, Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines, with involvement by the United States, by Japan, and other seafaring countries. Two border areas that are disputed between China and India, and Jammu Kashmir, contested by Pakistan and India. So 7 big major issues that set nation states of the Asia-Pacific region against one another. In addition to these, there are many smaller land border and maritime issues throughout the region, the Liancourt rocks between the Republic of Korea and Japan, the Bangladesh-Myanmar border. So there basically is a lot of dry tinder scattered around the Asian region, around the Indo-Pacific region. But what provides the oxygen so that any spark has the potential to burst into a major flame there is nationalism. Now, every country has a level of patriotism, and it's not a bad thing. But when it grows into a powerful, mindless nationalism, it has the potential to cause crisis and conflict. Nationalism can be fanned by political manipulation. It can be increased by the internet and social media, which give a sharpness and a power to it that perhaps it didn't have before. It can be increased and strengthened by economic prosperity, which provides both the resources to increase a country's military forces and a national sense that our time has come. It's time to fulfill our destiny and take what is ours because we're big and rich now. The other characteristic of nationalism is that it can be stimulated by challenges from other countries, especially those that are on the other side of one of these historical issues. Once a neighbor country resurrects a historical claim or issue, opposing nationalistic sentiment grows in the contesting country, and this grows into a cycle which is hard to wind down from, and often even hard to contain. So as I look at Asia's future, I see this interplay of increasing economic prosperity and interaction, and increasing nationalism and legacy issues on the other hand as the dynamic that will determine how it all turns out. Individual governments, whether they're democratic or authoritarian, will be deeply concerned with increasing the prosperity of their citizens. For democratic governments, it's crucial for their chances for being elected or being reelected. For authoritarian regimes, it's crucial to holding on to power. They must deliver the goods. Because the dominant model for economic growth in Asia is based on exports into the international market, governments have an incentive not to upset the security situation. The unique exception is North Korea, which stirs the military pot to gain economic concessions, but that's unique. On the other hand, fanning nationalistic sentiment is another political means for both democratic and authoritarian governments to strengthen their political positions, and we've seen this used in many occasions by many different governments in Asia. And the problem is controlling this sentiment once it has been aroused and set free as a political tactic by a leader. Now, because of its economic weight, its growing military capability, its geographical breadth in Asia, it stretches across the middle of it with maritime and land borders, and because of its history, China will determine much of the security situation in the Indo-Pacific region in coming decades. And so you've already heard from Aaron, from Michael Hunzeker and Yun Sun, their ideas on how China will develop. This dynamic that I talked about of economic development and nationalist-driven aggressive behavior plays out in China on a continual basis, and I believe it will do so in the future. I'm not one of those who believes with Henry Kissinger that China has a 1,000-year plan that they are turning the pages over every 6 months and starting on the next page. I think they're a very practical set of leaders, but their general direction is towards a greater, more powerful China, but in a cautious way. Now, up until 2010, the Chinese approach was to use its economic power and diplomacy as the primary means to achieve its historical ambitions in Asia. Especially in Southeast Asia, China relied on diplomacy backed by its economic weight to advance both its influence within the country and the region and its maritime claims. Chinese policy documents all stated that the world was in a relatively peaceful period and that China should take advantage of this period to grow its prosperity and to increase its influence. However, about 2010, and most dramatically at the ASEAN Regional Forum in Hanoi, China decided that it would move much more aggressively. At that meeting, the Chinese then Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi famously lectured the ASEAN foreign ministers, China is a big country, other countries are small countries, and that is just a fact. Not a fact that the small countries were particularly happy to hear, but it certainly gave a raw indication of China's attitude. And for the next several years, China took a much more aggressive set of initiatives in that region, sending oil rigs into waters disputed with Vietnam, evicting Philippine fishermen from Scarborough Shoal, expanding and fortifying reefs in the Spratly Islands. Now, those who follow internal Chinese policy debates have pointed out that these actions had been advocated within China for years, both privately and publicly, by hardline thinkers. They had argued that China's softer approach, which was China pursued, as I said, up to about 2010, was simply not working, that it was time to take sterner measures. And so about 2010, China decided to shift to this harder approach. But what China found in the next 8 years was that it paid a pretty heavy price for taking sterner measures. The other Southeast Asian claimant countries immediately took both diplomatic and economic and military measures to deal with this Chinese aggressiveness. They reached out to the United States, to Japan, and other countries for support. They offered access to their ports and bases for American forces. The Philippines brought a successful suit in the Permanent Court of Arbitration against Chinese claims. All these countries increased their military budgets, and they attempted to dilute their economic dependence on China by seeking alternative investments and alternative markets. And although China gained a bunch of small fortified atolls in the South China Sea at the strategic level, their position deteriorated between 2010 and 2017 in terms of the overall alignment of the region, which had been largely pro-Chinese before then and quite strongly anti-Chinese thereafter. As I say, Chinese are practical people. They rethought that set of policies they'd taken over the last couple of years, and now they've altered their approach again, which we've seen in the last year and a half, which is limiting these more aggressive military and paramilitary activities, increasing their diplomatic activities, most notably in agreeing to a draft code of conduct for the South China Sea, still maintaining their extensive claims in the region and still trying to use their economic influence in order to advance their own goals. And I would predict that these sort of rhythms of more and less confrontation, more and less cooperation, economic and diplomatic initiatives, use of military force short of conflict, that will be the norm of what we will see in the next several decades in East Asia. We can talk in the question and answer period about specific cases, but it seems to me that the probability of continued crises and confrontations in East Asia is virtually 100%, but the chance of major conflict there I would rate very, very low. Now for the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific region, South Asia, it's more difficult to envision a security future, but let me offer a few observations. The primary security development that you read in the literature is about the growth of Chinese maritime power in that region. The evidence that China is pursuing maritime influence in the Indian Ocean includes deployments of Chinese submarines to the region, port calls in Sri Lanka, deployments of Chinese surface combatants to the anti-piracy task force off of Somalia, the establishment of China's first overseas military base in Djibouti, Chinese leases on commercial ports in Pakistan and Sri Lanka that could be turned into military support ports, and the expansive public statements about its international maritime future, which are a staple now of public Chinese documents about their strategy and their policies and are echoed in leadership statements. Now, I do not doubt that China aspires to become a maritime power in the Indian Ocean, operating ships and aircraft from multiple bases with its policy preferences taken seriously by the other nations in the region, as they are by its closer neighbors in East Asia. However, there are major obstacles for China achieving this aspiration. The most important obstacle is India, with its own disputed territories with China, its long-running confrontation with Pakistan, and its belief that it should dominate the ocean that bears its name. India is and will continue to work relentlessly to deny or offset the establishment of Chinese military infrastructure in the region, primarily by offering alternatives and exerting pressure on countries that would offer bases to China. Moreover, when it comes to the deployment of maritime power in the region in crisis or in conflict, the Indian Ocean is India's home territory, whereas China must support its forces at long distances through choke points that are easily threatened or blocked. Beyond India, with the possible exception of Pakistan, there is no reason to believe that the other countries in South Asia would be any more willing to bend to China's wishes than have been the countries of East Asia, where China's economic and military weight is much, much heavier. We have already seen Myanmar pushing back against Chinese influence and canceling projects. Sri Lanka is not happy with its current indebtedness to China. Countries in the region would naturally look to gain Chinese support for the issues that they may have with their neighbors, and many would seek to play the China card in reaction to what they see as overbearing behavior by India. But it's difficult to envision any country in Southeast Asia becoming a pliant client for China. Now, a word about the sea lines of communication, or SLOCs, as they are inelegantly known by acronym. The threat to the SLOCs is a staple of uninformed commentary on the strategic stakes in the Indian Ocean. By the way, the same uninformed commentary is often heard about the sea lines of communication in the South China Sea. If China develops a strong maritime capability in the Indian Ocean, then it would threaten shipping, especially oil tankers, to other countries, India, Japan, Republic of Korea, and thereby bring them to their knees. So goes this line of thinking. But it is simply misinformed. No country has attempted to interfere with international shipping since World War II, except Iran and Iraq in the Persian Gulf in the 1980s, and that attempt was quickly squelched by a coalition of maritime countries led by the United States. It's virtually impossible to stop shipping selectively on the high seas, that is, to stop shipping going to one country while permitting other ships to proceed to other destinations, manifests change, flags change, everything changes on the high seas, and the poor lieutenant who has to go on board the ship, look at the papers, find out where it's going and what it's carrying and who owns it, is not going to be able to make any decisions that will effectively enforce a pressure on one country and not on others. The only places that ships, in fact, are vulnerable to interference are at choke points where they enter or exit straits. That's where, for example, Somali pirates operate on the western side of the Indian Ocean. That's where smaller groups of pirates in Southeast Asia have operated in the past along the Strait of Malacca outside the Strait of Singapore. Almost all the major shipping routes have alternatives. They're somewhat longer, more expensive, but not prohibitively so. So for all of these reasons, the specter of a Chinese threat to sea lines of communication in the Indian Ocean is, for me, a red herring. Now, I do anticipate that China will continue to deploy its Navy into the Indian Ocean, that the countries of the region will attempt to leverage Chinese support for their own security interests while giving away to China as little as they possibly can in terms of bases or other concessions, and that China will be in a better position, especially with its new aircraft carriers, to exercise gunboat diplomacy in the region when a crisis arises and when it decides that its interests are involved. However, this is a far cry from a dominant maritime position in the region. The dominant maritime power in the region will continue to be India, except when the United States decides to deploy major forces to the region. So overall in South Asia, in the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific, I anticipate a lower potential for crisis and conflict than the relatively low estimate I gave you in East Asia. I would anticipate that the issues of economic development will dominate the policies of the countries in the region, that these priorities will help to constrain crises and conflict. And another constraining factor will be the imperative to deal with environmental issues exacerbated by climate change. As I'm sure Sherry Goodman explained this morning, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, as well as the smaller countries of the region, all face major environmental and climate threats that will absorb a great deal of their energies. And these things tend to call for cooperation among countries to deal with them, not going to war. Now, this sort of muddling through business as usual projection may not be terribly exciting, certainly wouldn't be a bestseller, and I don't rule out black swans, but I think it is the high probability projection for this part of the world. And what's more, an Asian 21st century that would be a great benefit to the people of Asia and, in fact, to the entire world. So I think we should turn this speech into a dialogue, a discussion. You've heard a number of presentations on Asia in the 21st century during the course of the morning. So why don't we open up to comments and questions on things I've said or haven't said, or frankly, from what others said during the course of the morning. Helen?
Great.